Hi, I'm Bill McGrath, the Batavia City Administrator, and I'm with you for this week's Municipal Minute. This week we're going to talk about a very important topic, and that is the 2011 financial budget for the city. I'm going to take you briefly through a PowerPoint, but if you want more details about our budget, you can visit our website, go to the Finance Department section, and the budget for this year as well as the last 5 years are there for you to review. And of course, you can always call City Hall and ask to speak to myself or Peggy Colby, the Finance Director, to answer any questions you have. First, I'd like to take you through a summary of the 2011 budget. Without going into too much detail, the city budget has two major divisions. One is the different accounting methods used for the utilities, that is our water and sewer and electric. And then the rest of our accounting, which is called our General Activities Fund, and that funds, by and large, most of our employees and most of the money we spend on streets, vehicles, etc. And in that fund for 2011, we are estimating that our revenues will be approximately $22,635,000, which we believe will be up 1.5% from 2010 revenues, but still down 5% from 2008, and that reflects the economy and basically the severe downturn in sales tax revenues. On the expenditure side, we believe we will be spending about $22,982,000, which is 1.2% more than last year, but is 4.9% lower than 2008. So as we've been losing revenues, we've been cutting our expenses as well. Our deficit, in other words, we think that we're going to be spending more than we actually bring in next year, will be about $346,726. That is almost 13% less than the deficit we had last year. It is 4.8% more than the 2008 deficit. The city has a reserve fund, which I'll explain later, and if the budget in and of itself is negative, then we can use those reserves or our savings account to balance the budget. And the City Council has determined that because of the severe things that have been happening in the economy, that it's reasonable to go into our reserves, which are very healthy, and take us through some years to before we can get to a completely sustainable situation or the economy starts to get more healthy. In terms of those reserves, the health of a savings account of a city is measured in how many days the city could operate if all its sources of revenue were cut out. No real estate property taxes, no share of motor fuel taxes from the state, no share of state income taxes. So we will believe that at the beginning of 2011, we'll be starting with a reserve of $8,263,000, which represents 133 days of operating expenses. And we believe that at the end of 2011, we'll have about $7.9 million or 126 days of operating reserves. The general policy is to have anywhere from 2 months, 60 days, to 120 days, or even more for reserves. And with 126 days, Batavia is well above the generally accepted norm for reserves. So we feel we're in a very good position to try and get through the bumps of what's happening in the economy. The next slide may be somewhat confusing, but it attempts to give you the pattern for the last several years of the city's revenues, its expenditures, the deficit in the budget, the accumulation of reserves that we have, as well as the days of operation which remain at the end of each year. So as you can see, that the revenues certainly have gone down, but we've had some return of some sales tax income over the last several months, so it is somewhat on the rebound. Still nowhere near where it was in 2008, even less than what it was in 2007. But you can see that our reserves and our days of operation at the bottom of the chart have been moving downward, but very, very slowly. So we feel that we're in a good position. The next slide is called the General Activities Revenue and Expenditure Gap. And that is, we measure the gap between revenues and expenses, and we try and narrow that gap. Of course, hopefully you'd like to have more revenues than you do in expenses, But with the economy, that hasn't been possible despite the measures we've taken to decrease expenses. But as you can see, if you look at the size of the gap, beginning in 2009, we are decreasing that gap moving forward, and we think by 2012 we will be at a completely balanced budget. The next slide shows the history of our sales tax receipts over the last 4 years. And as you can see, the 2010 sales tax took a great drop in March of this year, but has started moving up in April, and basically has been on the upturn and is in fact greater than it was in 2009, but still less than what it was in 2007 and 2008. After this slide was prepared, we did receive another report, and I'm happy to say that the sales tax have been increasing slightly even more. So what is the city's strategy in closing the gap in the general activities fund between revenues and expenses? Of course, the main one is to reduce expenditures. We'd maintain a long-term staffing freeze. That's an issue we're going to be dealing over the next several years as we try to come to a point where the city operations are totally sustainable. We continue to look for efficiencies to offset fewer staff, because as you may know, we've laid off or through early retirement have about 13% fewer employees than we did 2 years ago. We have to evaluate the impact of these of the changes in staff on our service standard. We still have to be careful of the morale and the burnout of our employees, how far we can go. And then we continue to review retirement options for some of our senior workers. We focus on employee safety to reduce workman's comp injuries, which not only hurt our employees, but are a significant cost to us. The funding to workman's compensation was $200,000 more in 2010 than it was in 2009. So you can see that this is a very worthwhile endeavor. We have a safety committee, and we have an accident review with implementation of certain policies and standards. We continue constantly to research into savings for health insurance costs and contributions. We're reducing funding to the street activities, which means we're trying to do a little longer with the condition of our streets than we ordinarily would. We've done such things as decreasing some of our funding to BATV, which we think is a very important service, especially because it helps us communicate with a government, but we are diminishing that contribution a bit. And we are actually paying down some debts to the tune of $230,000 in 2014. And by that I mean we have certain loans that we're making payments on. And in 2014 we will pay off enough loans where we will regain $230,000 of payments that we're making every year. So we have that to look forward to. On the other hand, there are some expenditures that are just absolutely beyond our control and have to be supported. Our pension contributions have increased by $500,000 since 2008, and largely that's a function of the fact because the investment history of the pension fund were hurt just like everyone else's were, and the city has the statutory obligation to maintain certain funding levels. And secondly, health costs, of course, really depends on what's happening in the national trends and with federal mandates. So thus far I've explained to you that it appeared that the 2011 budget was not a balanced budget, that we would have to go into reserves to make it balance. The City Council also, in order to not use the reserves too much, looked at other revenue sources, as it's their job to look at this every year. And the staff presented to them several options, among them being an increase in property tax, bringing back the hated vehicle stickers, an increase in utility tax, an increase in our home rule sales tax, the possibility of a gasoline tax, and maybe the creation of a stormwater utility. And frankly, none of those were at all desirable to the City Council. They determined that the deficit that we are projecting for 2011, basically about $350,000, was not something that should be totally made up by getting new revenue from the taxpayers, and decided that they would levy taxes in the amount of $135,000 more than last year. So it's a very nominal increase. If people's assessed valuations have gone down, then actually their taxes will still go down. So the reserves will be used for the greater portion of the making up the deficit. The City Council has always tried to kind of spread the hurt among our reserves, our costs of operation, especially employees, and the taxpayers themselves, the owners of the city. Now earlier I talked about the utility budgets, and just to let you know, the utility budgets are under some pressure, but they are basically in healthy shape. The electric fund has about 110 days in reserves. We have about $2.2 million in capital projects scheduled for 2011, which are upgrades to our distribution network, which parts of are getting old. We're bringing in new wires, several underground wires in different parts of town, and we're working on our SCADA system, which will help us identify the exact location of breaks and the nature of some of those breaks so that we can get to them and fix them earlier. We're helped by the addition of a new customer by the name of Rubicon that makes synthetic sapphires. We've brought them on, so that's an aid to the electric utility. Water, we have about 276 days of reserves, which is very healthy. We're contemplating spending about $125,000 in capital for a vehicle and some engineering work. Wastewater, we have 173 days of reserves, which is still good. We are expending about $1 million this year for a new lift station at Carriage Crest. That's funded by some recovery zone bonds, very, very low interest loans through the federal government in Kane County. And then we are going to be using some reserves for operations, which of course, that situation can continue, and we'll be continuing to look to see what the answer to that is. This is just a brief look at the 2011 budget, but we thought it was important enough to make it the topic of a municipal minute. If you want more detail, as I said before, you can go to the city website under the Finance Department and see all our budgets for the last several years. You can go to BATV, which has the archives of our last several city council meetings at which the budget and the tax levy were discussed. And lastly, you can certainly call myself, Bill McGrath, the city administrator, or Peggy Colby, the finance director here at City Hall, to answer any questions you may have. Thanks for being attentive, and that's all for this week's Municipal Minute.